For those of you who have joined us, we're going to give folks a couple more minutes to join before we get started. And thank you all for taking the time to join us so far. I see the attendees are quickly increasing. So good to see all of you. Again, if you're just joining us, we are going to give folks a couple more minutes to join before we get started. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate your time. Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining the Rights and Legal Information for Visual Journalists panel. This is co-sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists, the National Press Photographers Association, and the Student Press Law Center. We're very happy to see all of you. My name is Ashanti Blaize-Hopkins. I am the president of the Society of Professional Journalists, and today I am joined by Alicia Calzada, the Deputy General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, Mickey Osterreicher, General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, and Mike Hiestand, Senior Legal Counsel for the Student Press Law Center. So why are we here? I want to kind of frame the issue a little bit before we get started with this conversation. So as many of you know, we have seen a growing bunch of protests across campuses across the country. And there have been journalists who've been covering this developing and highly publicized story over the last several weeks. And in these last several weeks, we've seen a number of journalists being detained and arrested by law enforcement. Fox 7 Austin photographer Carlos Sanchez at UT Austin on April 24th. We had a freelance journalist just yesterday, Sean Beckner Carmichael at UCLA. And then two Dartmouth student journalists, one a photographer at Dartmouth University just last week. So these are issues that we are facing. It is a concerning time. And that is the reason why we decided to pull together all of these legal minds that are absolutely amazing in their craft to be able to talk about how journalists, especially visual journalists, can cover these protests and do it in a way that is safe and that their rights are known and protected. So the first topic I kind of want to go ahead and pass out to this group here. The legal right to cover campus protests in general. When we talk about whether or not there are rights that are different from public institutions versus private higher education institutions, what does that look like as journalists start to go onto these college campuses in terms of what their rights are?
Mike, I don't want to put you in the spot, but given your,
I'm happy to jump
I'll
on that
let you
one.
talk
Yeah.
about campuses since that's your bailiwick.
You bet. So yeah, there is a significant difference usually between trying to cover these things on a private campus and a public campus, and the main reason is the First Amendment. The First Amendment only prohibits government censorship. In order for the First Amendment to kick in, there has to be some sort of government action, and so that is all typically going to be in place at a public school where you have a president that's a government official. You have campus police that are government officials. At a private school, it's a different matter, though. They are not government officials, and at least insofar as censorship, is concerned on a private campus, you typically, can't look to the First Amendment for protection against that censorship. That's been the case certainly with the student journalists that I work with, but definitely we're starting to see the impact of that is commercial journalists are trying to get on campus to cover this very newsworthy event.
Alicia and Mickey, is there a difference between the protections of professional versus student journalists, especially in these cases where they're going onto college campuses, whether private or public? Are there differences in the protections?
There shouldn't be, but in actuality, we see that they are. And we see that they are not just between student journalists and mainstream media, but oftentimes between mainstream media and independent journalists. And, unfortunately, we're all aware of the fact that that newspapers, television stations, newspapers are folding, television, everybody's cutting staff. So more and more, the media relies on independent journalists. And whereas if you're out on the street and you've got a big beta cam that says CNN on the side of it, there's a strong likelihood that you're going to be given a little bit more deferential treatment than if you're a student journalist who looks just like all the other students who are protesting, and the only thing you have in your hand is your iPhone and you're recording with that. But there's certainly no guarantees. I mean, we've seen CNN journalists arrested live on the air in Minnesota, after George Floyd. So there's absolutely no guarantee about anything. But under the First Amendment, student journalists, professional journalists, independent journalists should all be treated the same. The whole idea of the First Amendment is that it really protects the right of the public to receive information, and the press gets that benefit. And as Mike said, the First Amendment, Congress shall not abridge, and then it goes on through a number of clauses, freedom of expression being one of them, freedom of the press being another. It basically is one that restricts what the government can do in limiting those rights, not necessarily what positive rights that the press has, because oftentimes they don't have any more access rights than the general public, but they certainly have no less rights. So when we see students being allowed in a certain area, and then the press not being allowed in that area, that's a real problem.
Oftentimes I hear people ask the question, well, what can journalists do to protect themselves against law enforcement in these situations? But I often like to flip it and say, well, there should be some things that law enforcement should be doing to understand who is and isn't a journalist in these situations. Can we talk about the behavior here that really law enforcement should be looking at, and not, kind of indiscriminately deciding on their own who can and can't be a journalist?
I think that goes back to what law enforcement's job is. Their job is not to stop people from gathering information about government activity. Their job is to stop people from committing crimes or, vandalizing or violence. And so presumably we'd like to think the journalists are out there doing their job and they're not engaged in that kind of activity. So there really should be no reason why a journalist should get caught up in that stuff, or why a police officer should have a reason to confront a journalist. A lot of times we have problems with photographers because we're just obvious, right? You cannot not be there. You cannot not look like a photographer. And so people notice them, the police notice them, and maybe they're not too happy about what's going on. But it's really impossible for a photojournalist to just blend into the background and not be seen. And so sometimes we'll have situations where police will order an area to be cleared. What needs to happen is better policies on making sure that journalists are not excluded or arrested for remaining when those kinds of things happen. Another thing I wanted to add about your question about student journalists versus professional journalists, one thing we're seeing here is, when you're a student, you have a right to be on campus. So when these campuses are closed, sometimes student journalists are the only ones who are there. And I was wondering if Mike might want to expand on that and talk about, what we see in terms of those policies and how that plays out on campus.
Yeah, and I did want to just jump in. The piece distinguishing public or professional and student journalists. And I mean, one of the things that we see, you know, working specifically with student journalists, is one of the dangers, as Mickey pointed out, is my journalists sometimes look a lot like the campus protesters. And so, you know, one of our big tips to our folks is to just, you know, make sure you go out of your way, if you can, you know, maybe introduce yourself to law enforcement if there's time to do that ahead of time. You know, probably wear something that makes it clear, you know, big press T-shirt or something like that. Sometimes we've seen that kind of comes back to bite journalists these days, but do that, you know, make sure that you are not, you know, involved in you know, any of the chanting or taking part in any of the protesters' activities, even though some of them might be your classmates and peers. So yeah, it's really important, I think, for student journalists to do their best to go out of their way to indicate that they're there for a particular reason. Yeah, in terms of access to campus, you know, as Mickey said earlier too, you know, journalists have pretty much the same rights as anybody, and no more, when they're in places. And there just are certain places on campus that students have a right to be, that maybe commercial journalists don't. I mean, I'm thinking dorm rooms, for example. If you're doing, you know, we've had some really good reporting on journalists going into their dorms and just showing, you know, some lousy situations. You know, commercial journalists probably wouldn't be invited to go into those dorms in the same way. And so we're seeing that now with the protest, particularly at a private school like Columbia. You know, the way that Columbia is set up, they have the ability to gate off all of the public streets and to really make it, you know, a closed campus. And so we did see that the student journalists were given access to that space in a way that commercial journalists were not.
You know, Ashanti, going back to your original question of, you know, who is a journalist? I do a lot of training with police as well as journalists, because I found that I can tell journalists what their rights are and they can say, I know my rights. And that's usually going to be the last sentence they're going to utter before hearing, turn around, put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest, if they even get that courtesy, which they often don't. But I hear from the police all the time, well, how do we know who's a journalist? And what I tell them is, just like our criminal justice works on the principle of we would rather 100 guilty or 99 guilty people go free than one innocent person gets convicted. If somebody's out there, they've identified themselves as press, they're acting like press, they're taking pictures, they're taking notes, they're observing, they're not, as Mike said, they're not chanting, they're not carrying protest signs, then until they actually do something that's a criminal act, like throwing a Molotov cocktail through a window or graffiti on the wall or anything that one would not think a journalist would do. And I wouldn't care if the journalist was from the New York Times or, you know, from a school paper. If they're behaving like a journalist, then you allow them to then do what they're there to do, which is gather and disseminate the news.
I know that we have been talking a lot about the First Amendment and the protections under the First Amendment. Obviously, the press is protected, but so are protesters. Can we talk a little bit about that element of what's been happening at a lot of these campuses as this story starts to unfold? Maybe Alicia, you could start.
Are you talking about where protesters say
The privacy rights.
don't want to? Yeah,
exactly.
So that goes to sort of the very fundamental principle of privacy, right? You have privacy rights in a place where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. I cannot think of a place where there is less of a reasonable expectation of privacy than where you have chosen to go and chant in protest. So I've never understood this, I want to throw a protest and I don't want anyone to take my picture. It's a little odd. You know, if you don't want anyone to take your picture, there are places you can remain that, you know, as we were talking about, photographers aren't allowed, the media is not allowed, or it wouldn't be reasonable. And frankly, nobody's interested. But if you throw a protest, you should expect the media to show up. And if you start doing things that are combative or, you know, otherwise newsworthy, then you can expect people to be taking your picture. They're certainly entitled to, assuming that it complies with other guidelines and rules, you know, wear a mask or whatever else is going on. That's not the issue with journalists. But if they are out in public, they have no expectation of privacy, and journalists and photographers have no obligation to sort of honor that request.
Mike, I want to kind of shift this towards your domain a bit. I just recently got an email from some student journalists at a campus newspaper that I will remain anonymous at this point. But they were concerned about that. They had gotten some outreach from protesters who said, you know, I didn't give you permission to show my face or share my name. And they were concerned that maybe they were stepping across a line. But what Alicia is saying about journalists in general, those are the same types of protections and kind of guidelines that even student journalists should be following as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. You know, but this does bring up, and I think maybe we got the same sort of email from the same people there, because it really it brings up some really interesting questions between, you know, the relationship between law and ethics. You know, Alicia is absolutely right. You know, there is no more newsworthy event right now taking place in these protests on college campuses. Well, I mean, there are a few other newsworthy events taking place, but it's important right now. And so, yeah, their legal right to claim that, you know, they have any you know, right to be kept anonymous or anything is non-existent. But you know, there are ways to tell stories sometimes while minimizing harm. I mean, if a particular protester really does not want their picture posted, and it really doesn't add a whole lot to the news story, I mean, maybe you shoot them in a way that doesn't, you know, reveal what their identity is. So a lot of those conversations, you know, need to take place probably before you actually start interviewing the source, the protester there. Just, you know, make sure that, you know, if there's going to be some sort of agreement between you in terms of how they're going to be identified or not identified, you know, that all needs to be laid out ahead of time. You know, absent that, though, yeah, your journalists are pretty much, you know, photojournalists are it's fair game pretty much at these protests.
Mike, you bring up an interesting point about conversations beforehand. A lot of the issues that we're talking about here today are issues that you should not be talking about for the first time after they happen. And professional journalists have learned this. Student journalists, this is a perfect time and a perfect opportunity. Talk to your professors, talk to your editors, your staff, your sort of faculty advisors, you know, whoever your mentors, your professional mentors, whoever's available to you to sort of start thinking about and talking about these issues. Great time to have all of these conversations, because this is not the last time you're going to face these situations. You're going to face these situations in your professional career, hopefully many times, because hopefully you'll have a wonderful, long, successful career. That's the goal. And so this is the time in your life when you can kind of sort out and figure out not just where your employer stands, but where you stand, because sometimes you may decide that your personal ethics are tighter than the ethics of the place that you work. You have your own ethical brand to protect. And in fact, your ethical reputation is your most important and valuable asset. And so talking about all of these things and your ethics ahead of time and now, there's no better time.
I just wanted to touch on a couple of the points that were made. In terms of being outside, it's one thing for photographers to have cameras, and somebody comes up and says, you don't have permission to take my picture. And I would suggest that you point them up to the poles in the buildings and see how many cameras they can see that are taking their picture. Based on what Alicia said, when you're out in public, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. Just because the person has a camera in their hand and you, the protester or anybody on the street, might say, don't take my picture. It's, you know, unless you want to walk around with a mask or a cone over your head or something that prevents you from being seen by any of those cameras. We're photographed and recorded scores of times a day everywhere we go, and that's just the way things are. The second point, and Mike made it earlier, that really creates a problem is while we're trying to identify ourselves as press to police so they let us do our work, the danger comes in that when there are protesters who don't like the press, we find ourselves being attacked by those protesters, with the police just kind of standing by and not doing anything, unfortunately. So, there's a real problem in that. And it's that balancing act between, whether you keep your credential inside your shirt or your jacket and only bring it out when the police are there, so they can identify you. And then the third thing also that's been talked about is, aside from having conversations with each other and with your editors, and I urge the police to do this too, to have conversations with the police when we know that there's going to be a protest. Um, and an ongoing basis. You need to introduce yourself to them. They have a job to do. We have a job to do. And the sooner they see us as people who want to go home to their families at night and are doing a job to provide a living to support their families just as they do, the more likely it is that they won't treat us as this, oh, it's the press. And they don't really particularly care anything, just like, oh no, the cops are here. Everybody's human. And the sooner we can have conversations about what are the rules of engagement are going to be? Where can we go? Trying to do it in the middle of a demonstration or a riot or a march to get somebody that, if you're lucky to find the PIO or the incident commander or somebody in charge, it's very unlikely at that time that they're going to have any time or inclination to pay any attention to having a rational discussion with you. So you really need to have those discussions and ongoing discussions and establish, just like you would with any other source. You can go to a source and have a conversation if you've had an ongoing conversation with them before, as opposed to just calling them and saying, hi, I'm from so-and-so, will you talk to me, for the very first time? So I think those are all things we should keep in mind.
Mickey,
I
maybe
think
you
that's
want
a really
to offer.
important
I'm
distinction.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Mickey, that's a really important distinction to make, that journalists and law enforcement are not adversaries, right? Journalists are very clear that police and law enforcement have a job to do. We just want to be able to do the job that we have been sent there to do as well. Alicia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mickey, do you have suggestions for how people can start those conversations?
Yeah, call up the PIO on a day that's hopefully calm and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, whether you're new in town or whatever, or I just, was told that this would be a good idea. I'd love to meet you for coffee or for lunch, or, I'll come down to your office, or you can come to whatever works to have that conversation, meet face to face. You become a person with a name, with a family, with things that make us all human and care about each other. And if you get told no, or there isn't, just be persistent, just like you would to try and find out some information about a story. If somebody says, no, I'm not going to talk to you, do you just give up and go, I guess there's no story today? Just do the things that you do as a journalist. And you'd really be surprised. When I do the training, sometimes, I'm talking on the phone to somebody and trying to convince them why their department should allow me to come and do it. And it's finding the right person. So also use your sources for networking. If you're new at a news organization, find the senior person. Say, hey, is there anybody at the police department, sheriff's department, whoever it is that I would love to meet them and have a conversation. And, also talk to your own publication broadcast team and say, maybe we should meet as a group. Anything that will kickstart engaging with one another is so much better than trying to do this either after the fact when we're writing letters telling them what a crappy job they did by arresting and harassing people. Again, one of the things I do with law enforcement is, I don't think most people think about it, but we have, as journalists, a whole lot more in common with law enforcement than either side thinks about. During COVID, neither one of these professions could do their job from home. You can't police the streets from your basement. You can't, as a photographer. Maybe some of the reporters could call a story in and get it over the phone. But as photographers, as you said, Alicia, you're either out there or you're not. When something bad is happening and everybody is running in the opposite direction, who's going towards it? First responders, law enforcement, and the media. And both professions are highly criticized for the job that we do. So, it's like no matter what we do, we don't get it right. No matter what the police do, they don't get it right. Sometimes that's justified. Sometimes when we make mistakes, that's justified as well. So there's a lot of commonality there, and you just really need to develop those connections. And it's going to help you so much more than if you're out on the street and somebody actually recognizes you. It's like, wait a minute, and you're getting grabbed, and we've seen it happen so many times. And that's the problem, is they know who the journalists are in mainstream, and they're like, they might grab them, and then somebody says, no, cut them loose. And yet an independent journalist remains zip tied and taken down for booking.
When we talk about the rules of engagement, I want to also talk about this point of knowing what the penal codes to cite when you do happen to engage with law enforcement, when there's a process where you are being zip tied and you could be on your way to a jailhouse. Alicia, Mike, also please jump in on this. The importance of kind of knowing the laws, not only generally from the First Amendment, but in your particular state.
Yeah, so one thing that came up recently in California, because there was a bill recently passed that gives journalists additional access during protests and address some of these issues that we're talking about. And a lot of journalists know this as the bill number, but police are taught on the penal codes, as Mickey can tell you. And so the suggestion that came from that, and it's a good one, is, in addition to learning your rights, learn the penal codes, learn the specific laws that you're dealing with. There's also laws in New York that are that give rights to take pictures in public, and rights to take pictures of police activity. So you want to know those specific code numbers. Even if you spent a lot of time talking about the bill, in California, it's penal code 409.7. Yeah. So I'm not even going to say the bill. I didn't look up the bill number because I don't want to say
90,
it.
SB 98.
Think about it. Yeah. So,
Mike,
it's interesting.
Go ahead, Mickey. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's interesting, that Alicia, that you brought that up, because internally we were having a discussion the other day about, well, 4097 really pertains to police. But if you look at the language of it, it says if peace officers, as defined in, and that's what happens with a lot of these laws, they reference some other law and they talk about another section. That section defines who a police officer is. And we were talking about that and looking at that. And if you look at that section, at least in California, peace officers are defined in actually two different sections: a member of the University of California Police Department appointed pursuant to another section, but that, and a member of the California State University Police Departments. So they're peace officers, and therefore 4097 would apply to them. I know initially, Ashanti, we were all like, wait a minute, since we're dealing with campus police, are they subject to 4097? And they clearly are.
Yeah. Mike, can you jump in here, especially with student journalists and understanding what their rights are as far as penal codes, as far as even campus regulations and rules, because they're not laws, right? Campuses can put rules and regulations and guidelines in place. Even if you break them, you're not breaking the law.
Not breaking the law, yeah. And but at a private school, they hold quite a bit of weight. I mean, if there is a rule or law that says that you can't be in a particular place at a private school, very often that's gonna hold the argument there. So, but yeah, no, at a public school, any sort of rules, restrictions they have on where you can or can't report from, they all have to be in line with what the First Amendment says. Yeah, the First Amendment is kind of the final word on those sorts of things. One of the laws that I talk with my folks about all the time is the Federal Privacy Protection Act, which also talks about when you're out covering these events, if you're arrested, it makes it very clear they cannot take your work product, the photos that you've taken, the notes that you've taken, those sorts of things, those are all protected. So I think having some basic understanding of the laws is important. I mean, you have to realize that, at these protests, there's nobody going to be listening to you, citing a lot of penal codes and things like that. Typically, that's stuff that typically happens later on. But it's
Yeah,
important to know. It's important to understand what your rights are, so that you can make the best argument you can later on, that you're in the best place that you can be, and not violating, clear rules that are in place, or clear laws that are in place.
and
Other
Mike, it's
shipments
interesting that the intersection between the Privacy Protection Act, the intersection between student journalists and regular journalists. The Privacy Protection Act of 1980 protects all journalists, and yet it stems from a case that involves student journalists when police went into their office and seized all their files. And they said, okay, well, it seems that they have a right to do that. So Congress said, we're going to pass a law that protects journalist work product based on that. So as we're seeing now, the student journalists are often in the forefront of things.
As we kind of talk about that part of it, I do want to shift to this idea of censorship of student journalists. We've seen a lot of different cases where we have student journalists who have been threatened to have their press credentials taken away. They've been threatened with arrest, or they have been told, I think in Colombia, the case there, where if you leave this room, we will arrest you if you go outside and report on this story. So when we're talking about issues of censorship, what are some things that fall in line when it comes to student journalists' right to publish and denial of access to either the newsroom or threats of press credentials being taken away? What are the rights that those student journalists have?
So again, this is going to be, where there's a big difference between public and private schools. We'll start with the easy one first. Public schools, we're lucky. I mean, at the public university college level, we've got really, really good case law on the books, going back more than 50 years. It makes it clear, basically, that a public college student journalist has essentially the same sort of First Amendment protection as, the reporters for the local commercial newspaper, the New York Times, or anything like that. So school officials really, at a public school, they have to have a hands-off policy, unless they can show that the material is clearly unlawful, obscenity, libel, things like that we all have learned about in class to stay away from. Or, there is some talk, if their conduct is really disruptive, materially and substantially disruptive, there may be some on-roads for school officials to step in. But a public school, yeah, their ability to interfere with student journalist work is quite limited. At a private school, it's a much different thing, and it really does depend generally on the school. The rights are going to vary by school. Typically, the most protection that you're going to find at a private school is something policy based. At Dartmouth, for example, where these two student journalists were arrested, Dartmouth has a really strong policy on the books that talks about just how important we think free speech is for students, and Dartmouth is the place that the quintessential marketplace of ideas. Really great lofty language. And we would argue, in fact, that it pretty much says that the First Amendment applies on Dartmouth's campus. And so Dartmouth didn't have to pass that policy, but because they did, courts have said you basically have an agreement. You have a contractual agreement. Students are paying their tuition to go to your schools based on some of these promises. There's an agreement, and if Dartmouth has been seen to have breached that agreement, we're going to follow and see what's happening there. But that would be one of the tools that we might use is holding their policy up and saying, you guys broke the policy here.
Along those same lines, when we talk about the rights that student journalists have against subpoenas, what does that look like? Because that can often be very terrifying for student journalists, even for their faculty advisors, and understanding what those rights are, I think, are critical.
Well, I think go ahead, Mike.
If you want me to take that, yeah, I mean, I will just say real quick, you're right. Subpoenas can be a bit trickier. I mean, they're trickier for all journalists, but for student journalists in particular, very often the main source of legal protection in those cases is your state shield law. And sometimes, one of the things you have to look for is, what is the definition of a journalist in those laws that are protected? And sometimes we do have issues for my student journalists who typically are not paid. Sometimes they are, but there's language in there that that says, this covers, paid journalists or journalists that are engaged in journalism as their livelihood or something like that. A lot of states, most of the states, thankfully, don't have that limiting language, and student journalists can use their various shield laws and First Amendment, protections and things like that. But in some cases, New York is one, for example, I know where there is some language there that has been used to limit the ability of student journalists to use the state shield law. We've had to look for our protection in other places.
I think it's important for people to also understand the difference between a warrant and a subpoena. So in Carlos's case, the one that you mentioned earlier in Austin, so the police there actually issued a warrant for his arrest, which means that if he was walking down the street or he was driving a car and he got stopped by police and they ran a records check and there was a warrant, they could immediately arrest him and take him into custody. And the thing about that, and the thing we've seen with other things, is when you make a warrant application, one of the things that most magistrates, judges want to know is who is the person that you're seeking the warrant for. And it's very rare if they are told ahead of time that this is a warrant for a journalist that they will issue it. Oftentimes, law enforcement leaves that little fact out. For a subpoena, when you're issued a subpoena, it gives you the opportunity to be heard. So you have to appear on a certain day in court. You have an opportunity to bring your lawyer. You have an opportunity to present evidence and make arguments as to whether or not you will have to comply with whatever it is that they are seeking. Under a subpoena, they don't have the ability to just arrest you unless you fail to show up for the subpoena, and then they can get a warrant issued for your failure to do that. So again, it's really understanding what type of legal issues you're dealing with.
I want to shift a little bit to some of the questions that people have put in the Q&A, and then we'll come back to a couple of the more questions that I had prepared to ask all of you. So one person on the chat asked, as a freelancer in Northern California, where Cal Poly Humboldt recently had a police sweep, press were cuddled off campus between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. and then were told we needed to produce press passes as duly authorized news reporters before being allowed back on campus per California Penal Code 49.7. As a freelancer, I do not yet have these credentials, although I'm well known locally for news. What can we do as independent media to meet this?
Well,
Mickey, go with you because
it's been somewhat vague what a duly authorized representative is. And, the arguments that I've made is that some people that are bloggers have hundreds of thousands of followers and more people read or hear from them than possibly a columnist for the New York Times. So just the way it was written does not require you to have a government issued press credential. Obviously, that is better, but you can make up. My understanding is as long as you have something that's a business card, that doesn't look like you did it with crayons in your basement. I mean, take some time to do that. You can actually go online. One of the things for NPPA members is we have what's known as a member ID. We went out of our way to say this is not a press credential. It's a member ID, but it says National Press Photographers Association with a press written a little larger than the other three words. It's got your picture on it. You can only get it if you're a member. But we've seen those as being recognized as identifying somebody as a duly authorized member of the press. But certainly it is more difficult if you're working as an independent. If you're on assignment for somebody, ask them, hey, can I get some type of identification from your organization that I can laminate and use when I'm asked to identify myself? And some organizations may do that. Others may be reluctant to because they're worried about, an employee relationship versus an independent relationship. And there's all kinds of labor laws, especially in California, that give everybody a headache about that. So it's not easy, but it's not impossible either.
I'll just say for student journalists, I know at one time the Associated Collegiate Press and then the National Scholastic Press Association for high schoolers, they had similar sort of credentials that they provided to their members. I'm not sure they're still available, but definitely worth checking.
Many years ago, when I was a freelance photographer, but way before I became a lawyer, I made a little credential for myself on my printer, and I put it together with a luggage tag. So it was basically like a business card sewn together with a luggage tag, and I hung it from my neck. Nobody ever complained. But here where I live in San Antonio, Texas, they used to give out sort of press credentials in the county courthouse, and they stopped doing it. And some government agencies have stopped doing it. And the reason behind that is somewhat philosophical. And there really is an interesting philosophical question when it comes to, should government entities really be credentialing journalists or providing press passes kind of a thing? Because the last thing we want in life is the government deciding, you're a journalist, you're not a journalist. Sorry. So sometimes they'll come up with objective criteria, but the purpose of a credential is really just to identify you. It doesn't make you a journalist. It doesn't give you a right to take pictures on the street that you wouldn't otherwise have as a general member of the public. And so that is always something to keep in mind. The government can give additional rights to journalists if it wants to, but it cannot take away rights that everyone has. Just because you're a journalist, you're not a journalist.
And I just have to give a quick shout out, thank you to Mickey, who just, New York City just redid some of their credentialing processes for press passes. And Mickey was a champion for student journalists out there and made sure that we were included in the definition. Because, as Alicia said, I mean, having the government decide is going to mean that, some journalists are not included in that list. And thankfully, Mickey stood up for students out there.
We're talking about very serious things, but actually having a sense of humor oftentimes works wonders. So, when I was out, like Alicia, I was a photojournalist in both print and broadcast for almost 40 years, over 40 years, and went back to law school. And I used to have, as many journalists, a chain with all kinds of credentials on them. And one day, these were after abortion protests, and the police were not particularly being mindful of your press credentials. And I went home and I found my Monopoly set, and I took the get out of jail free card and I laminated it. And that was the top credential. And I can't tell you how many stern officers would come up to me, see that, and almost burst out laughing. Like, it literally stopped them in their tracks. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody go out there and do that, because I think, the effect will not be the same as seeing it for the first time. But be creative, think about things, and try and maintain that perspective, because cops have a very wacky sense of humor, much like journalists.
I'm going to go to one more question in the chat here. When we're dealing specifically with dispersal orders, other than changing the laws of the state that you're reporting in, what can be done about this? If there's a dispersal order, obviously journalists want to be able to remain in place. What's some advice that you can give to journalists that don't have state laws that protect them in those situations?
So one of the things that I want people to keep in mind is that in order for them to issue a dispersal order, they need to decide that there is an unlawful assembly. And that basically means that the people there are there for no other purpose than something that's unlawful. And as we saw in the case in Minnesota, in Goyette, where the judge said, I understand that, but journalists are there for a very lawful purpose. They are fulfilling their requirements, to inform people. And the fact that you may be declaring an unlawful assembly should not apply to journalists. What should apply to them are reasonable time, place, manner restrictions. So that means you should be allowed to stay where you can see and hear and do your job. But for example, there are 200 protesters blocking the intersection. They're all in the street. the police issue a dispersal order declaring that assembly unlawful. Now, they're supposed to give you time to do that, to disperse. We often find that they kettle, they surround everybody, and there is nowhere to go. So one of the things I tell people is you really have to maintain situational awareness all the time. If you're looking through that viewfinder and you've kind of got blinders on and you don't see what's happening, that's not a good thing. You need to pay attention. You need to be familiar or try and familiarize yourself with police actions. If they bring the bikes in and they're starting to encircle you, you need to start moving out of that encirclement before they complete it, because they're not going to let you, out. But back to that, unlawful assembly and reasonable time, place, manner. So what they should do with journalists is say, listen, you guys get out of the street and stand on the sidewalk. You can shoot your pictures from there. But if you're still in the street in the next 10 minutes, you're getting arrested. That's trying to be reasonable time, place, manner. It doesn't always work, but that's the distinction that should be made. And so we've seen from 4097, it allows people to be behind police lines. So again, if you've established that good working relationship with police, hey, is it okay if we shoot over your shoulders? Now, it's not often that police want somebody in back of them that they don't know, because they don't have eyes in the back of their heads. But the law is made so, at least in California, so there's a possibility of doing that. Again, having that working relationship with law enforcement, they're now not going to worry about you. They know who you are. They're not going to expect you to do something unexpected that they have to worry about. But it's just a matter of working with police and trying to figure out things ahead of time, not when it's all happening, because it's usually not going to work then.
As we near the end of this webinar, I want to cover something that specifically is related to visual journalists, and that is registering copyright for images that they have. Obviously, we are in a social media age, and these images are critical to telling these stories, but oftentimes you have people using the images. And obviously, we want to make sure that people are credited and paid for the images that they have captured. Alicia, can you talk a little bit about that part of it and how visual journalists can go about registering their images, especially if they know it's going to be something that is highly, highly newsworthy?
Yeah, sure. That's a really great point to address, because you get these great pictures, you worked hard, you've fought, you've maybe been in some tough situations, and you want to protect your right to earn from those images or that video footage. So just a short point is that you own you have a copyright to the image the minute you capture the image. So you take out your iPhone, click, you've made a copyrighted image right there. There are no formalities for obtaining the copyright. However, you get additional benefits for registering your copyright. You can get statutory damages, you can get attorney's fees if you need to enforce your copyright. And so it's really important, if you feel like you've gotten useful images that really are powerful, resonate, that people are going to want to use, that you register as soon as possible. You can go to copyright.gov, and there's a little link there called registration, and they have video guides, all that. You can register up to 750 images in a group. So you could say, like, 2024 protest, put all your good stuff in the group. It's a little more, you have to fill out a lot of forms and stuff, but it's definitely something that people can do on their own, and I highly recommend it. There's a grace period between, the first publication of the image and that registration deadline, which recognizes the fact that you may shoot a picture and 5 minutes later it's gone around the world. That's the life experience of a lot of photojournalists these days. So there is this grace period, but you want to, if you have images that are of great interest and great, power, you want to register them as soon as possible and maintain control. And then, you'll see on social media a lot of these, is this image yours? Can we use it? negotiate. You have a right to be paid. And this is, again, if you're a student, a great time to get started learning these habits and learning this stuff so that you know.
Alicia, it's 90 days, right? Is that the grace
Or
period?
it's 3
3
months.
months.
For some
Yeah.
reason, they don't like 90 days. They like 3 months. It's a
Yeah.
3-month look back period. So you, as Alicia said, publish that picture, you put it online. It's, people start using it and you're like, wait, time out, stop. And you have 3 months and then you get copyright protection back to that very first publication. The one thing, because copyright is so complicated and we could spend days and weeks talking about it. The one little exception I would say to Alicia's point about that, yes, when you make the image and it's in a tangible form that can be communicated to somebody else, the copyright vests, except, and there's always those little exceptions, if you're working for a publication, if you are an employee, if it is a work for hire, they are the ones, unless you have some agreement with them, that actually own the copyright to that image. And it's really good, especially for student journalists, because I've had to deal with this issue on behalf of them, where after the fact, the publication that they've been shooting for says, no, we own the images, even though the student has been not paid, not gotten any credit, use their own equipment, all of these things that would mitigate in favor of them owning the copyright. So please, if you're shooting for a publication, just like I said, have conversations with police about rules of engagement, have conversations with whoever you're shooting for about who is the copyright holder of that image, whether they're licensing it from you, whether you're allowed to license it. Again, we could do another whole, hour at the very least on just copyright, but
That's a really good point, Mickey, especially as it relates to student journalists and student newspapers. Are you an employee or are you a volunteer? And what does that mean? What if you get a stipend of $14 a day, which, as I understand it, hasn't changed in some student publications since 30 years ago when I was a student. I think that we worked with the SPLC to come up with a contract, sort of a model contract. Am I right?
We do. So yeah, on our website, it is a big deal for student journalists to get this agreement in place beforehand, just so everybody understands kind of, the page they're working on. But yeah, we have a model copyright agreement that tries to kind of balance the needs of the student journalists against the needs of the media organization.
Yeah, the worst thing is you've risked your health and safety as a student to make these amazing, compelling images, and then you find that all kinds of other people are making money off of it except you.
In the last couple of minutes of our webinar, I want to give all of you an opportunity, 2 minutes, to share just one last piece of advice as journalists, whether they're visual journalists or other journalists, are going out covering these stories that clearly are not going to go away anytime soon. So why don't we start with Alicia, and then we'll go to Mike, then we'll go and have Mickey have the last word here.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's really important. I'm glad that so many people are here learning about their legal rights. But it's also important to think about, what are you going to do when you're in this situation? And specifically, when things go south with police officers, the most important thing you can do is remain calm, right? You can talk about your rights, but you don't want to be screaming, you don't want to be fighting, you don't want to be kicking, because then you have new problems, right? That aren't related to their mistake, but then they become your mistake. And so just always remain calm. And the same thing is true with other problems involving the law, like copyright violation and subpoenas and stuff like that. We can work on all this stuff later, but we want to remain calm in the situation and in our responses.
Mike.
Yeah, and I'll just, this is not the first time Mickey and Alicia and I have done panels like this. I mean, our students, journalists in general, but students are getting really good at covering these protests. We had lots of these conversations during the Black Lives Matter protests and COVID coverage and things like that. So, I've been just talking a lot with reporters calling up, really concerned, I think, about their safety and what they're going to do. Fortunately, one of the things, there have been a few exceptions like Dartmouth and things like that. But for the most part, most of these most of these protests and most of the coverage of these protests has been very peaceful. It really isn't until the police are brought in and there's a whole discussion to be had about what's happening there on our college campuses. But until that, for the most part, the students are really doing a good job and doing the story. I will say, talking to the Dartmouth reporter, I mean, she really did, the reporter and the photographer there, they knew that they were subject to being arrested and some of the things that happened there. But they told me, the reason they stayed is because they knew that the reporting they were doing was important. I mean, they were watching one of their professors get slammed on the ground by reporters, and she said, I kind of knew that I might be arrested, but somebody had to capture that story. Somebody had to be there. If I wasn't, doing my job as a reporter, that story wasn't going to be told. So yeah, our folks are doing amazing work right now.
Mickey, last word.
So I'm going to give you a couple of things. One, as I've been talking about communication, we're in the communication business. If you're shooting for a publication, if you're shooting for a broadcast, if you're shooting for some other entity, find out when you go out there, before you go out there, do they have your back? Do they have a lawyer in place? Do they have if they're going to go, hey, if you get arrested, you're on your own. Don't look at us. You need to know when you're putting yourself out there on the line, what resources you have. And you certainly have the resources of SPJ and SPLC and the NPPA if you join those organizations, because we cannot do this without members. Nobody cares what I have to say, other than when I'm saying it, I'm often speaking for the NPPA. The other thing is keep rolling. If you're shooting stills, figure out a way that you're working with somebody else or you've got another device to keep recording. And even if you don't get great video, the audio itself, if you get good audio, because a lot of times, even if you've seen police body cams, they're so close that you really don't see what's going on, but they can hear it. And as Alicia said, remain calm. You want protesters to seem out of control. You want the police to seem out of control if they are. You don't want to be the one out of control. The last thing you want is a resisting arrest on top of whatever else they're going to charge you with. Because when, let's say we're looking for bail and the judge asks questions of like, did they resist? No, they were compliant. They listened to what I told them, it will have a difference in the officer's attitude towards you as well. If you start yelling and screaming and kicking, that's the worst thing that you can do. But having that recording, because there's a presumption that an officer is telling the truth when they do their misdemeanor or felony narrative, that is going to be the underlying charges that they're charging you with. They've got to factually present some evidence that you met those elements of those charges, and they will do that. And sometimes they won't be truthful. If you're saying, no, I didn't do that, that's one thing. If you've got a recording that says he said, she said, and you've got it on tape, oftentimes the best thing we have is that. Hit play and sit down, and they'll hear it for themselves. So again, also work with somebody else. Don't go out there on your own. Make sure that somebody knows where you are. And then the last thing is, if you get arrested, you are going to have all of your equipment seized as well, which in some ways is good. You don't want them leaving your DSLR out on the street when they take you into custody, because it's not going to just sit there. But on the other hand, they take your phone. So many of us are so used to just using our phones and just saying, dial mom. You don't even remember the number. Take an indelible marker and write an important number on there, and make sure it's a number that somebody's going to answer. You have that one lifeline call. It's just so important to make sure that you have somebody that you can communicate with. So I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other things, but I can see we're running out of time. And Ashanti, you've done a great job, so I think you should have the last word.
Thank you so much. I do want to thank our panelists today, Alicia Calzada, Mickey Osterreicher, Mike Hiestand. Appreciate the conversation. And all of you for joining us today in the middle of your day. On the West Coast, it's still the morning, but on the East Coast, it's in the afternoon. Just so that if anyone happened to miss any of this webinar, we are recording this. So we will make sure that we push the link to this recording out on all of our social media platforms so that you all can watch this again and share it with a friend. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye.
Thank you.